Story 1. From an American perspective, I would really like to see how things would change if Lincoln had not been killed and the United States government had followed through on Reconstruction. Story 2. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, a large crowd of people stood ready to storm the headquarters of the Committee for State Security. For some reason, they did not. If they had, I am pretty sure Russian history would have been very different. Story 3. When my father passed, I wish he could have seen the latter part of my teen years. I think most people, disregarding the more obvious entertaining or intriguing speculative answers, would choose an event in their personal life if the choice was actually offered to them. Story 4. Honestly, as a historian, I would not dare try to change anything. You don't know what the effects of the change will be, intended or unintended. Something with a butterfly. Changing your dinner a few days ago will likely not change much, but the further back you go or the bigger the change, you'll see more unexpected and possibly unwanted effects. Story 5. Around 15 years ago, I accidentally passed gas in front of a girl I liked. Completely ruined the mood. If I could go back in time, I would choose to pass gas either before or after talking to her. Story 6. There are a bunch of serious answers that would drastically change the fabric of reality as we know it and possibly prevent all of us here from existing, so I'm going to be slightly sillier and target a specific niche topic in my hobby. In summary, Pokemon Legends Kyurem comes out as a Wii U launch title instead of Black 2 and White 2 on the Nintendo DS. Pokemon Black 2 and White 2 feel odd to me. It's probably a better Unova overall, but it feels so hollow because you're always seeing remnants of the first games, but the player character and N aren't around. We did get more Kyurem lore, but not the original complete Kyurem, and it's after this point that the Pokemon games are generally agreed to have been questionable in quality, right? The Wii U came out 5 months after Black 2 and White 2, and was seen as a flop partly because it had no killer launch app, which reduced third-party support, which made it sell worse, which reduced third-party support, etc. But you know what makes consoles sell in droves? A new Pokemon game. And Pokemon Legends Arceus is one of the best things Game Freak has done with the franchise in a while. They experimented, we finally got an open-world-ish Pokemon game, the gameplay loop is addictive and makes you want to actually catch all the Pokemon, and we get to see into Sinnoh's past. It also has regional forms, which became a thing in Generation 7, and more evolutions for past generation Pokemon, which became a thing in Generation 8. Unova's history mentions a past war between the factions of the two brothers who eventually made the original Dragon split into 3. So imagine if we got the open-world Pokemon game that we've been clamoring for, with regional forms, regional evolutions, more past generation evolutions, a more serious wartime storyline. We've still never seen what non-sport combat looks like in Pokemon, if I recall correctly, and the original Kyurem back in 2012. This would bring Pokemon fans swarming to buy Wii U's and convince third-party developers to invest more in the console, as well as give us earlier cross-generation evolutions and regional forms, and possibly Legends games in Generations 6 and 7. X and Y still go on to release on the Nintendo 3DS, or maybe the Wii U with an open world like Sword and Shield, carrying forth regional forms and cross-generation evolutions while introducing Megas, and from there, who knows? Legends Shalebi? Legends Ultra Space? Legends Zygarde? Oh wait, they're doing that one. The Wii U is even a good console for it. You could show the overworld map on the gamepad, maybe also a team overview rather than it being on the pause menu in Pokemon Legends Arceus, or even pin Pokédex objectives that you want to do so that they're always visible to remind you. Maybe the item bar goes on the gamepad so you can easily swap between items to throw, I don't know. Yes, I have been thinking about this for a while, why do you ask? Story 7. Change things so Alan Turing was never driven to suicide. The guy was one of the first to truly grasp where computers could go. Just imagine what he could have accomplished with another 20 or 30 years. Plus, he kind of deserved a happier end. Story 8. A lot of people talk about going back in time to kill Hitler, but what if you went back in time and befriended Hitler? He had a difficult relationship with his father who used to regularly beat him. He was also deeply affected by the death of his younger brother, who died of measles. He dreamed of becoming an artist, but his dad tried to force him into a more normal career. I think if you intervened at a young age, you could guide Hitler onto a gentler path. Story 9. I would simply make the driver of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife not turn down the wrong road in Sarajevo in 1914. He did, and when he stopped to reverse, the car stalled right in front of Gavrilo Princip, who shot them both. 2 world wars resulted. Admittedly, something else could have triggered the wars given the state of affairs, but it would be interesting to see what differences there would be. Story 10. For more recent history, changed the 2000 election so that Gore ended up in the White House instead of George W. Bush. Politics aside, Gore was and remains very serious about addressing the global warming crisis. Had we started on that path more aggressively 24 years ago, we would probably have mitigated a good number of the weather and heat-related catastrophes we are seeing now. Instead, we got Captain Cowboy and the oil baron, a war in Iraq, and Hummer sport utility vehicles. Story 11. Taft being picked by the Republican Party in 1912. I would have them pick Roosevelt instead so that Woodrow Wilson is never elected President of the United States. A small change, but it would make the world an infinitely better place. Story 12. That's a tough one. If I could change any point in history, I would probably choose something like preventing major conflicts, such as avoiding World War II. The amount of suffering, loss of life, and long-term impact it had on the world is unimaginable. Stopping it could have changed the course of history for millions of people. Story 13. Everyone that is saying prevent World War II, I understand, but it could have unintended consequences due to the butterfly effect. And there's a good chance that people might not have even been born due to circumstances after World War II that led to their meeting. Grandfather paradox. I might get downvoted to oblivion for this, but I am not changing history that much. I'd probably give all of the current knowledge I have to my younger self so he can lead a better life and future. Or I'd make myself buy Bitcoin. Story 14. The burning of the Library of Alexandria resulted in the loss of so much knowledge. Texts we will almost certainly never recover, diagrams, schematics, sea charts, shipping manifests, and so much more are gone, reduced to ash, lost, and forgotten. Story 15. I want to see what would happen if Constantine did not convert Rome to Christianity. It might have remained a small and benevolent religion, and Europe would have developed much differently under paganism. Story 16. Jimmy Carter being re-elected in 1980. If Ronald Reagan never became president, it is most likely that America would be in a much better place than it is now because a lot of major societal issues affecting Americans are because of Ronald Reagan's economic policy. Another ramification is that Al-Qaeda wouldn't have been as well armed, which would potentially mean the war on terror would never happen. Story 17. Stop George W. Bush from stealing the 2000 election. That's basically the failure point of modern America. No Bush means probably no September 11th, which means no forever wars in the Middle East, number 2008 financial crisis, a stronger middle class, and climate change policies in time to actually matter. It was a literal world-changing event. Story 18. Changing the Treaty of Versailles. This was a big part of the start of World War II and the rise of Nazism in Germany. If we could change how World War II was, maybe we could have avoided all the World War II and after issues that have occurred. Story 19. Have Goldwater sign the Civil Rights Act. In our timeline, Goldwater went against the Civil Rights Act due to his staunch libertarianism and principles, but what is interesting is that he had no problem with the majority of the act. In fact, he not only signed every other civil and voting rights act of the time period, but was a supporter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and fully supported marriage equality way ahead of his time. What he disagreed with were certain aspects of the act relating to federal employees and government power that he viewed as government overreach, and it was this that he opposed. But because he opposed the Civil Rights Act and campaigned on a libertarian platform of states' rights and giving power to said states, Southern whites, in what was essentially a protest vote, voted against the Democrats and, for the first time in their history, voted Republican. What this did is that it showed the grand old party that Republicans can win the South, and it was subsequently Nixon and Lee Atwater that pursued this with the Southern strategy. From there, the modern parties began to take their positions, with the grand old party focusing on law and order, welfare queens, and opposition to Roe versus Wade to appeal to Southern whites, culminating with the presidency of Reagan in the 1980s. But let us say, in an alternate timeline, Goldwater ultimately decides to sign the Civil Rights Act. Immediately, the main changes would be that the Southern states that, in our timeline, went to Goldwater instead go to a Southern Dixiecrat such as Strom Thurmond, George Wallace, or Robert Byrd, with Goldwater instead winning a number of states in the Rockies, such as Montana and Idaho, that he lost in our timeline due to being against the Civil Rights Act. In the long term, however, this would have massive implications on the Grand Old Party, as without his victory in states such as Mississippi and Alabama, the Southern strategy, from which the modern Republican Party was born, would not have happened, and instead the party would likely have turned in a completely different direction. To see that play out, let us turn this into a scenario. Starting with the point of divergence, as we have discussed, in the immediate aftermath, Goldwater would lose states like Mississippi to a Southern Democrat and instead win a number of states in the Rockies that, in our timeline, went to Lyndon B. Johnson. As in our timeline, Lyndon B. Johnson likely loses support and popularity due to the ongoing Vietnam War and eventually decides not to run for re-election in 1968. With this, butterflies begin to spread out, affecting both the Grand Old Party and the Democratic National Committee. Let us say Robert F. Kennedy is never shot in California but still loses the nomination to Hubert Humphrey, and Nixon loses the 1968 Republican nomination to a combined ticket led by liberal Republican Nelson Rockefeller with libertarian Republican Ronald Reagan. Remember, at this time, Reagan was one of the most socially liberal governors in the country, notably expanding abortion rights in California, and would later go on to oppose the Briggs Initiative and protect gay teachers, only pivoting to social conservatism during the 1980 campaign, which was itself inspired by Nixon's Southern strategy, which in this timeline would not exist. Like in our timeline, the 1968 election is close, but in the end, Nelson Rockefeller and Ronald Reagan win, and with an easy landslide victory against Scoop Jackson in 1972, remember, McGovern only gained prominence after Robert F. Kennedy's death during the 1968 convention, and Robert F. Kennedy would likely stay out of the race knowing Rockefeller's likely popularity and knowing he would likely lose, would have two pretty successful terms, eventually succeeded by his vice president, Reagan, in 1976, which, without Watergate and an overall very successful term, would be a pretty easy victory for the incumbent vice president. From here, the stagflation of the 1970s, combined with the oil crises, the Iran hostage crisis, and a multitude of other problems in the late 1970s, would tank Reagan's term, with economic libertarianism and voodoo economics being blamed, and Democrats gaining sweeping victories in the midterms, culminating in a landslide victory for Robert F. Kennedy against Reagan in 1980, with Robert F. Kennedy overseeing the economic boom and recovery of the 1980s. Eventually, this creates a party system with social democratic progressive Democrats going against socially liberal and moderately libertarian Republicans. Story 20. Block Mark Burnett from making the television show The Apprentice, thus preventing uninformed voters from mistaking one unqualified, immoral, incompetent 2016 United States presidential candidate for the effective businessman he played on TV. Without reality television, I think the last decade of American politics plays out in a way that leads to less loss of life in the pandemic, less erosion of human rights, and somewhat less environmental damage. Story 21. Changing a key event could have massive ripple effects, but I would probably prevent the burning of the Library of Alexandria. Imagine all the knowledge we lost. Story 22. I would put Big Bird on the Challenger. I want to know if they would acknowledge the actor who died or have to introduce to the world that Big Bird died. Story 23. Benjamin Butler accepts Lincoln's offer of the vice president slot. Andrew Johnson becomes a historical nothing, and federal reconstruction moves forward. Story 24. I'd change the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. It held so much knowledge and wisdom that could have advanced our understanding of the world. Losing all that history feels like such a huge loss. What about you? Story 25. The Sultan of Persia at one point in the 1200s refused an offer of a peaceful free trade agreement with the Mongols and was subsequently defeated, causing a great downturn in prosperity for the Persian world. I wonder what the world would be like today if these two empires went through with their peaceful coexistence. Story 26. I would save John F. Kennedy. I feel like a decreased emphasis on war, a decreased normalization of spending trillions on the nation's credit card in the pursuit of pointless wars, and an appeal to commonality and rationality in national and international discourse would greatly benefit the United States and the wider global population. The Vietnam situation certainly wouldn't have unfolded the way we now know it either. Story 27. Prevent Bush, Cheney, and the neoconservatives from stealing the 2000 election with the Supreme Court's help. Imagine if instead of countless wars and multiple economic crashes under Republicans, we had common sense leadership and early effective action on climate change.